So first, I'll describe to you what machine learning is. Some of you maybe know that, some of you perhaps don't. So I'll spend about 10 minutes describing machine learning, and then I'll present 3 different studies which we conducted recently during the last year. So each of these studies will take also about 10 minutes. So in total, it will be about 40 minutes. And yes, please ask questions. We have plenty of time for that as well. Right. Okay. So what is machine learning? For our purpose today, we're talking about 2 types of machine learning: supervised learning and reinforcement learning. Now, just to check, I hope you can see my slides, and I hope you can see the right slide. So can you see the slide with supervised learning and reinforcement learning on it?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's great. Thank you. Right. Okay. So let me explain the difference between supervised learning and reinforcement learning, and where we use each one of them. Right. So how supervised learning works? You use it mainly for classification. For example, suppose you show examples of tangled ropes to the computer, and some of them are not knotted, they are only tangled, so you can untangle them into a rope which has no intersections. And some of them are genuinely knotted, so just by pulling different parts of the rope in that direction or some other direction, you will not be able to remove all crossings. So in the example on the slide here, the top diagram is not knotted, it is the trivial knot. The bottom diagram is knotted. So you present examples of diagrams which are not knotted or which are knotted to the computer. Obviously, you don't give the computer only 2 diagrams. Perhaps you present to the computer 1,000 examples of diagrams which are not knotted and 1,000 examples of diagrams which are knotted. And the computer somehow tries to understand what the difference is between this class and that class of data, between the diagrams which are the trivial knot and the diagrams which are non-trivial knots. And after that, you want to use this agent which has learned to distinguish between diagrams which are knotted or not knotted. But even before you actually start using it for testing if a particular diagram is knotted or not knotted, what is interesting in itself is testing your agent. So you put aside some other diagrams and you use them as a test set. So here is another diagram. I happen to know that it's not knotted, but the agent does not know it. So somehow from the examples which the agent has learned on other examples, the agent should guess whether this diagram is knotted or not knotted. And after that, we can make a conclusion whether this particular machine learning technology on this particular problem is successful or not successful. If it is successful, then accuracy at the testing phase will be greater than 50%. If it's not successful, then it will be a random predictor, then the accuracy will be 50%. For each particular diagram like this one on the screen, the predictor will just guess whether it is random, whether it is knotted or not knotted. Right, so let me say again, if you have any questions, please ask me. So we have finished with supervised learning. Now let us look at something perhaps more complicated and perhaps more interesting, reinforcement learning. Right.
Can I quickly chip in here and just ask?
Yes, please.
Do you give the machine learning algorithm the picture, like a bitmap with like the pictures you have shown, or what do you give exactly to the
right? Yes. My answer should split into what we have done so far and what it is possible to do. When you talk with machine learning or when you talk with artificial intelligence more generally, you definitely use some pre-processing depending on what kind of computer science or what kind of machine learning you want to study in this particular study. So, for example, when we work with nodes, we never actually give the computer the actual photographs of nodes, for example, like on this diagram. We represent them in some way, for example, as a list of these fragments and the list of what intersects with what. I'll speak about some representations of nodes later today. Here is one of interesting and important questions of machine learning. Which parts of the problem are best delegated to machine learning, and which parts of the problem it is better to pre-process. And you know, in every experiment of this kind, you really choose what is better to do. So there is machine learning where you want the agent to learn on examples, and there is pre-processing where you feed data to the agent in different formats, and some of these formats will be easier for the agent to learn. Some of them will be more difficult for the agent to learn. So I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, thank you.
The answer is yes, it is non-trivial. For example, if you look at this particular diagram on the screen, we would like to be able to feed descriptions of arbitrary node diagrams to the computer, to the agent to learn. But on the other hand, it is difficult for the computer. It's kind of non-linear. It is difficult to describe to the computer the shape of this diagram. So if you can consider some other simpler diagrams like braids, for example, and I will show an example later, a braid can be represented, for example, as a word. So it is so much easier for the computer to start working with it. Right. Okay, so reinforcement learning. In reinforcement learning, you work in a different way. You don't show examples to the agent in advance. Instead of that, the agent itself produces examples on which it is going to learn. And the reinforcement learning usually is applied when the agent can make a sequence of moves. So, for example, you can teach the agent to solve the Rubik cube puzzle. The agent starts with the Rubik cube in some random position, and the agent makes some random moves, and it arrives at some other position of the Rubik cube, which is also not the solved Rubik cube. On the other hand, perhaps some other random moves which the agent uses, perhaps they can lead to a solved Rubik cube. And in this case, you sequences of moves like this, and you generate many of them. You look at sequences of moves like this, and also there are many of them, and you allocate rewards for these moves. If a sequence of moves has led to some position of the cube which is not solved, then you tell the agent not to use these moves in these positions anymore, or at least use them more rarely. And if the agent has solved the problem, then you advise the agent to use more of these moves in these positions. Perhaps not every time, but more frequently. And this way, it is more likely each time after each iteration that the agent will solve this problem correctly. It does not happen immediately. One example of training the Rubik cube took about 2 months to train, but eventually it happens. Right, have you got any questions at this point? Right, okay, so if you have no questions, Let me just remind you. So we have supervised learning, which is learning on examples, and we use it, for example, to classify knot diagrams between trivial knots and untrivial knots. And reinforcement learning, which is used to generate some desirable multi-step behavior. Right, and let's see where deep learning comes into it. If you look at the Rubik cube, for example, then perhaps in a particular position, rotating the top face 90 degrees clockwise might be a good move. However, there are many positions of a Rubik cube, and there are many positions, about 10 to the power 18, where it might be a good idea to use this particular move. And it is impossible to store in the computer memory all these positions. There are very simple approaches to machine learning, to reinforcement learning, which use exactly that. However, in general, you need somehow to compress your data. So deep neural networks, in this case, if you don't go into detail, act as a kind of data compression algorithm, which allows you to consider fewer positions instead of all actual positions. I'm not going to define deep neural networks. It is much easier, if you don't know about them, to do it interactively. Just go to TensorFlow Playground, just type TensorFlow Playground in a search engine, and it will take you to this link, and there you can experiment with doing supervised learning with deep neural networks. And here is one example of how reinforcement learning and deep learning are combined. In one of our studies, we use DQN. DQN literally is a combination of Q-learning and DNN. Q-learning is one type of reinforcement learning. It is awful from the point of view of computer memory. It stores every position in a lookup table, and for every position, it stores all possible moves from this particular position. However, if you combine it with deep neural networks, then somehow all this data becomes compressed in a way that we can cope even with a reasonably large example. Right, okay, so this is what I wanted to tell you about deep neural networks. Let me just add that there are traditional deep neural networks, so they are called feed-forward neural networks or multiple layer perceptrons. They usually work fine. However, we have done research trying to find some mathematical problems which these neural networks cannot solve in the scenario of supervised learning. And we found such mathematical problems. And after that, again, we tried to find some kind of neural networks which can solve these problems. And we found graph convolutional neural networks plus something else which can solve these problems. So this is what we are currently working on. Right. I have said everything I wanted to say about machine learning. Have you got any questions? Right, okay, if you have not got any questions, then I'll proceed to talking about some of our studies. And the first one is untangling braids. As I have said after you asked me, it is possible to represent knots in different ways. And after that, after you have presented knots, you can feed them into different types of agents for untangling. And after that, these agents can be different sizes, different configurations. So there are some recent studies which explain how they untangle knots. So we're talking about untangling. So it's not just classification that this particular diagram is a trivial knot, but we always start with some diagrams of a trivial knot, and we want the computer to explicitly untangle this node until there are no intersections in the diagram. And we started with a simple example, which are just braids. And we successfully wrote the code. There are quite a number of choices you need to make. So it took us some time to generate code which is successful on most braids. But we are successful, so you can read our short paper. So let me say again, it is reinforcement learning. So we start with a braid which is tangled, and you can pull some fragments of the ropes up or down on this diagram and behind each other, and you end up with a braid which is completely untangled. And let me present to you some choices which we had to make. For example, in this particular study, we use random trivial braids. So we generate a random braid, we check whether it can be untangled. If it can be untangled, then we feed it into the agent as one of the examples on which to learn. But we could have used something different. In some of our studies, we construct braids which are tangled on purpose. So we have this agent which learns to untangle, and we have the second agent which learns to tangle braid in such a way that the first agent doesn't know how to untangle them. So this second way of constructing badly tangled braids is interesting, and we have done it in some easy scenarios, but we are going to try it on more complicated and more interesting scenarios. And it is interesting because this way you can produce some very badly tangled braids. And eventually, as we proceed to knots, we plan to produce some examples of hard unknots, as knot theorists say. That is, some knot diagrams which are very hard to untangle, although we know that it is possible to untangle them. Right, so apart from choosing how to produce examples on which to train, let me present you some other choices we needed to make here. You can present a braid as a word. Usually in group theory, you use sigmas here. Or you can present a braid as a matrix. So here, for example, there is an anti-clockwise half turn, and here there isn't. So you put -1 here, 0 here, and so on. So we were happy to use this encoding of braids or that encoding of braids, and this answers your question. We don't feed a braid into the computer as a photograph of a braid. No, it is. We could do it, but it's just a different type of research. We are not really studying visual recognition. We want to see how the computer copes with the mathematical part of the problem. So we represent a braid or something else, either as a word or as a matrix, depending on what is better. Then another question is what randomizer moves to have. We all know that to untangle braids, you use the second randomizer move and the third randomizer move, but each one of them comes in several flavors, depending on which of the strands are tangled and depending on in what order they are tangled. So, for example, there are 6 different versions of the third randomizer move, so we had to decide whether we want to program all of them or just one of them, but then the computer would have to use the second randomizer move on either side of them to get to the right version of the randomizer move first. So that was one choice, and just using our experiments, we decided what is better, what is worse. Another decision we made, neural networks work much better with input of a fixed size. So we said that we fixed with the length of a braid. So it means that we have some positions in the braid where there are crossings and some positions where all the strands just go parallel to each other. So eventually, when we have untangled the braid completely, it still consists of exactly the same number of elementary braids, just they all are trivial diagrams of braids. Right. What else did we need to look at? In some mathematical problems, you can apply every move at every position. For example, when you solve the Rubik cube, from every position of the Rubik cube, you can rotate every face of the Rubik cube in every direction. But it's not always like this in every mathematical problem. For example, if you want to apply the third randomized move to the beginning of the braid, to the left-hand side of the braid, not always you are allowed to do that. So we had to decide whether we tell the agent which randomized moves in which positions can be applied to this particular braid which the agent works with at the moment. And yes, it helped, so we do that. So it's not exactly a part of machine learning, it is pre-processing. Just because it was easy to calculate, we do it, and it helps the agent to learn. And obviously, one question is, what size of the neural network we need? It is a deep neural network, so it consists of, well, how should I say it? So you have the braid, then you have the next layer where this braid is drawn in some other way. Then perhaps you have the next layer where it is drawn in yet some other way. And then you have a finite layer where there are recommendations in which positions, which randomized move to use. So how many layers do you want to have? And how big do you want the layers to be? This is also a practical question. Right, okay, so this is all I wanted to say about braids. So have you got any questions? Right, okay, so if you haven't got any questions, let me talk about the next study. At some point, we were doing research not in machine learning, but just in mathematics. There are certain diagrams in mathematics called Gauss diagrams. I will define them in a minute. And some of them have a property that they are called realizable. Obviously, the concept was introduced by Gauss in approximately 1854. Then it took people some time to actually describe realizable Gauss diagrams, and then did it in 1936. And after that, different people, including ourselves, introduced some different descriptions of realizable Gauss diagrams. And so we were just generating realizable diagrams and applying different conditions which describe realizable Gauss diagrams just to test our own work. And we noticed that descriptions from two recent publications don't match all others. So we found some counterexamples, we found errors there. And starting from there, as I will describe, we started thinking about what we can do in terms of machine learning. So let me briefly describe to you what a Gauss diagram is, if you don't know. So here is a curve. Imagine that you are a little train going along this curve. And before you start traveling around the curve, you denote each crossing on this planar curve by a letter or by a number. So here, for example, crossings are 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, suppose you are a little train starting from 1 and going along the curve. You go in this direction, 1, then 2, then 3, then you go all around this large loop. And then the next crossing you see is 3, then 4, then 1, then 2. So this list of crossings in the order in which I listed them right now is called the Gauss word. And it is traditional to write the Gauss word around the circle like this: 1, 2, 3, 3, 4, 1, 2, 4. So as you can see here, I just write the crossing in the order in which I meet them on this curve as I travel around the curve along the whole length of the curve. Right, and now it is traditional, you don't have to do it, but it is traditional that on this diagram you connect with a chord inside the circle those two instances when you visited the same crossing, like 1 is connected to 1, 2 is connected with 2, 3 is connected to 3, 4 is connected with 4. So this is the definition of a Gauss diagram. So as you can see, this Gauss diagram corresponds to this planar curve, but not every Gauss diagram corresponds to a planar curve. If it does, then it is called realizable. If it does not, it is not realizable. And this is our first example. We produced many other examples, but this is our first and smallest example of size 9 of a Gauss diagram, which is not realizable, but which in some recent publications, according to their theorems, should be realizable. So we found this counterexample. We found also many other counterexamples of slightly larger sizes. And it was interesting from the point of view of mathematics, but on the other hand, we thought it is interesting from the point of view of machine learning. So we have a mistake in at least 2 published papers, and there are many examples and counterexamples which can be used, and these examples and counterexamples are small and they are finite, so we can easily produce them and we can easily feed them to the computer to use supervised learning to learn which Gauss diagrams are realizable and not realizable. And what we wanted to establish is whether when we teach the computer to classify Gauss diagrams as realizable or not realizable, it was interesting to see whether the computer will make mistakes on exactly those counterexamples which human mathematicians have overlooked in their papers. So we used supervised learning, as I have said, and again, we did not feed Gauss diagrams as circles with chords in them. A Gauss diagram is just a pretty diagram which represents a Gauss word, and the Gauss word can be represented in different convenient ways as matrices. In general, I would say that neural networks like binary matrices, so we represented Gauss diagrams in 4 different ways or as binary matrices. And indeed, as we say in the title of our paper, the same instances confound artificial intelligence and human mathematicians. So let us say again, if you have a random predictor that did not spend any time learning at all, then its accuracy will be 50%. Sometimes it will be right, sometimes it will be wrong. After we have trained artificial intelligence on Gauss diagrams, it can classify Gauss diagrams with accuracy 75%. And if we feed our counterexamples, those that don't match the descriptions of Gauss diagrams in the papers where we found a mistake, then this accuracy drops to 20%, not just to 50%, but much lower than that. So as you can see, there is really some mathematical content there. We don't exactly know what it is. We're not working with explainable AI right here. But as you can see, human mathematicians have overlooked a certain condition, and artificial intelligence also overlooked some conditions which express exactly the same. If we actually feed more of our own counterexamples, so if we just disproportionately fill up the training set with our counterexamples, then accuracy is improved. At least it becomes greater than 50%. Right. So this is our second study. Have you got any questions about that?
Sorry, one quick question. I'm assuming you trained it on a balanced data set where half of them were realizable and half were non-realizable?
It's a good question. I believe we did that, yes. I cannot remember the code now exactly, but yes, I totally believe that this was the case, yes.
Super, thanks.
Yes, actually, yes, I have remembered now. Yes, it was balanced, yes. The training set was balanced.
And how did you generate the non-realizable cases?
Well, there are not that many Gauss diagrams, so you can just prepare a list of all of them up to a certain reasonably small size, for example, up to size 12. And after that, you can just choose at random some from the list of realizable ones and some from the list of unrealizable ones. Does it answer your question?
So I'm assuming it's easy to check whether a Gauss diagram is realizable or not realizable.
Yes, the answer is yes. There are some descriptions which are not constructive, which if you implement them, they become an exponential algorithm. But there are very good algorithms, and we have written one, for example, which is quadratic and which is really easy to implement. And they work fast, and they can easily tell you whether a Gauss diagram is realizable or not realizable.
Okay, super, thanks.
Right, okay, so I'm coming to the last part of my talk, recognizing the trivial knot using quandles. I will define quandles, and I will explain how they are related to being the trivial knot. So in this research, we pursued several aims. One of them was to learn to work with different types of knot diagrams. So, for example, in the first study, which I was talking about, we were just working with braids. But actually, we want to learn to work with arbitrary knot diagrams, and this is one of our steps in that direction. So let me just talk to you about algebraic knot theory. You look at the parts of the curve which go from one undercrossing to another undercrossing. So if you look at this arc C, for example, here, it emerges from under the arc F here, goes all the way here, and then goes under arc F on this side. So an arc is a part of the knot diagram between one undercrossing and another undercrossing. To start with, denote each one of the arcs with a letter. And after that, as you want to produce a group or something like this, introduce some relations at each crossing. So let me give you the simplest example. This is what is called Fox coloring. Look at this crossing, for example. Each crossing is a neighbor of 4 different letters. So here on the northwest you have A, in the southeast you have B. So right on one side of the equality A plus B, and what passes over this crossing? It is C. So in the southwest you have C, in the northeast you have C. So write C plus C, which is to C on the other side of the crossing. and do exactly this for each crossing. And after that, take all these relations and just solve them and find the values of all the numbers A, B, C, and so on. So to do that, you will need to work in modular arithmetic, modular a certain number n. If you choose n correctly, then you will be successful at solving all these equations and finding the values. And this number n is called the determinant of the knot. So this is one concept, which is a very simple example of a quandle. Now let me define quandles in a much more general case. Suppose you are working with a group and you have group elements F and G. Then let us introduce abbreviations for this conjugation and this conjugation. So let us denote this conjugation by F triangle G, and let us denote the opposite conjugation by F triangle -1 G. And now let us forget about the usual group operation. Let us forget about multiplication. Then let us just concentrate on these operations, triangle and triangle -1. You will imagine that they have several useful properties. For example, you can guess that if you apply triangle G to F and then apply triangle -1 G to what you got, then you get back to F. So if you now express all properties of these two operations, not using the original group operation, then you get a description of an algebra called a quandle. And instead of using Fox coloring, we could use somewhat more complicated relations at each crossing, which are expressed in the language of these quandle operations. And quandles are one of best invariants of knots, and they definitely can be used to find out whether a knot diagram corresponds to the trivial knot or not. So for small knot diagrams, and the diagrams which we used in this experiment are small, these claims are equivalent. Checking whether the knot diagram is the trivial knot, checking whether the determinant is equal to 1, and checking if this knot diagram can be colored by a number of small quandles where the list is actually prepared in advance, and we have some publications on that, and other people have some publications on that. So this is supervised learning. We take a knot diagram, we tell the computer whether the determinant of it is 1 or not 1. On the other hand, we tell the computer whether it can be colored by one of these quandles or not. And we want the agent to learn to distinguish between trivial knots and not trivial knots. Right, so this is what I have just said. And as I have said, one of the goals in this research was to use different knot diagrams. And in this particular study, our best results were on petal diagrams of knots. So let me define petal diagrams. If you have any diagram of a knot, imagine that you are looking at it in 3 dimensions and it is made out of wire. You can bend this wire in such a way that in the end, when you look at the diagram from your point of view, all crossings are behind one another. So instead of several crossings, you see just one crossing. This particular diagram, as I write there, is not drawn correctly. Actually, if you fold the trefoil knot in such a way that you can see only one crossing, you need not 3 petals like this, but 5 petals. So Petal diagrams are convenient to use for the computer for machine learning. Why? Because a petal diagram is defined by in which order all these arcs pass behind each other in that one crossing. So it is easier for the computer to imagine a petal diagram than an arbitrary diagram with many faces and many crossings. In our experiments, accuracy was around 96% with relatively small diagrams, but also with a relatively small agent. And one thing in particular that we did, first we started feeding just the standard permutation matrices into the agent. It worked, but not as impressively as 96% accuracy. So we invented a new kind of matrix to represent permutations even better. So this is an example of pre-processing data. We are not solving the problem for the agent, but we try to encode the data in a way which is better for learning. All right, and here I want to show you a slide on the data set being not balanced. As you can guess, if you consider arbitrary diagrams of the same size, then perhaps more of them will represent the trivial node than untrivial nodes, or perhaps vice versa. But in this particular case, more diagrams represent the trivial node. So as you can see here, we really tried to balance our training set, and we also balanced our test set. Right, okay, so let me just give you a short summary. So as you can see, we try to find the best available machine learning technologies, and we find some simple mathematical problems, which are classification, or which are finding some sequence of steps. And we see whether machine learning can solve these problems. So as you can see, it's not exactly research in machine learning, although we contribute to that. It's not exactly research in mathematics, although we contribute to that, but it's research in both mathematics and machine learning. Right, okay, so on this I'm finished, and if you have any questions, please ask me.